Good day, philosophers. Today we're going to start our reading and discussion of René Descartes' Discourse on Method. Fundamentally, in today's class, we're going to learn about part one of Descartes' Discourse on Method, and this is a really interesting book. This is written in the 1600s. It's about 2,000 years later in history from where we left off. For the most part, we've been reading Plato and Aristotle. We did talk a little bit about Kant and Mill, sort of as intermediaries, and they are actually philosophers that come after René Descartes. But and the next philosopher we're really reading in detail is Descartes, and in particular this Discourse on Method. Though we're also going to read some bits of the Meditations on First Philosophy. Isn't it nice that those two books came together in this little tiny book all as one? And we're actually going to read virtually the whole of the Discourse on Method. We'll see that the Discourse on Method is broken up into 6 parts, right? So in our table of contents here, you'll see there's parts 1 through 6 of the discourse. I wrote in some information about what each of them are about, and I just want to quickly summarize the way this text is going to be set up. So we're going to see off the bat, part 1 is going to be the sort of starting point of this entire text, quite literally is, obviously. But in part 1 is where Descartes is going to set out his goals for education. He's going to think about his own education and talk about what his 2 fundamental goals are for all learning. What's the purpose of learning things, right? So we'll see what those 2 goals are. And then we'll see, starting in part 2, we'll see Descartes starting to set up a method for achieving at least the first of those 2 goals. We'll see the kind of method that he'll come up with. Part 3, we're actually not going to read. We're going to skip over that. It would be worth looking at, but for the sake of our abbreviated class, we can skip it. But we'll jump to part 4, where Descartes is going to talk about the method that he described in part 2 and start to apply it. And here's where we're really going to see what could be called Descartes' epistemology and some metaphysics. And we see some applications. And in part 4, we're going to ultimately see how Descartes achieves the first goal he's going to have for his education. Part 5 is then going to be a departure. In part 5 and part 6, Descartes is going to deal with the second goal he has for philosophy, right? And part 5 will ultimately talk about this new idea of the physics of nature that's fundamentally presented by Galileo, and Descartes is going to find incredibly influential. And then we'll see it culminate in part 6, where in the idea of the mastery of nature, which will ultimately serve to solve the second goal for our education, right? And so let's just think about education. Well, let's get back and focus. Let's start thinking about our education in general. Why do we get educated? Why are you in college? Why do we have people? Ooh, come on, let's focus. Why do people go to high school? Why do we have education at all? Well, some people might say that they go to college and stuff like that because they want to be able to get a job, or at least the kind of job that they want to get. They want to be able to make money, right? And they want to have enough money. That's a money sign. Make enough money to sort of live the life that they want to live. Some people talk about how education is ultimately related to equality and equity, right? Trying to make sure that everyone has an equal footing and an equal chance in this world to sort of do the things that they want to do and be equal citizens with one another. Some people talk about how the goal of education is simply to learn and to understand things that you wouldn't understand at all. In many ways, actually, I would say education is about building up culture, right? It's about developing a common set of stories and a common language with which we can interact, which is sort of building up our society as a whole. And so, I mean, there's a lot of different ideas here. But if we go back, that actually, starting with Descartes, and if we want to get a sense of how he is a very modern philosopher, Descartes is called the father of modern philosophy, right? And you might think that's funny because Descartes writes his philosophy in the 1600s. And can I spell when I'm trying to speak quickly? Descartes is considered the father of modern philosophy. And that might seem weird, like I was saying, because he's writing in the 1600s. That doesn't sound very modern. That's a very, very long time ago. But we're going to see that part of what makes him modern is his sort of modern idea of what the purpose of education is. Sort of, if we think of it in a classical sense, if we look at the way things used to be classically, right? Classically speaking, that education was something that was sort of divided into 2 parts. There was sort of thinking about what the purpose of a university is. And the ultimate goal of a university in sort of a classical sense was knowledge for its own sake, right? It was to just know for its own sake. The pinnacle the pinnacle of a university, the pinnacle thing you could possibly study, believe it or not, as you might imagine, was philosophy and theology, right? Why would you study philosophy and theology? Because you want to understand the most important things, right? Other things that you would study in university, ultimately just for the sake of someone trying to become wise and trying to understand. It sounds very philosophical, really, right? And that was this sort of classical idea of education. But then there's a lot of practical things that you'd want to learn. And where did you learn practical stuff, right? Where did you learn practical stuff? Well, you didn't necessarily go to university to learn practical stuff. You might learn them through ultimately guilds or like apprenticeships and things like that. So if you wanted to learn particular skills, that's where you went. Now, if we look at today's modern universities, we see a weird mishmash of stuff, right? And sort of the modern university that we actually have the university try to do both of these things at the exact same time. And I think that's one of the reasons why our modern universities are in such disarray to some extent, is because they're not entirely sure what they're doing, right? What do I mean? You can go to a modern university and you can study philosophy, right? In the modern university, you can study theology, but you'll also study nursing, right? And you'll also study a business, right? And there's fundamentally something different about, say, nursing and business and philosophy. Like philosophy is something that's ordered towards just knowing for its own sake, even though it can have some practical uses. Nursing and business and things like that are the opposite. They're not necessarily studied for their own sake. Nursing is studied in order to sort of help others, right? Can you read that? I hope you can. Business is sort of studied to, well, maybe it's to help others, but to help yourself. It's to make money to some extent, right? And these are ultimately very practical things. And so we have this weird tension within our modern universities between this classical idea that the purpose of a university is for the sake of wisdom and building up culture and learning, versus a lot of the practical aims of education that also seem to be taken up by the university. And so we kind of had this interesting, I would argue, almost a kind of schism that can cause a lot of confusion. It's one of the reasons why, to some extent, you guys, when you are taking this class right now, most of you are, or none of you, to the best of my knowledge, probably are philosophy majors. Every so often I'll have some philosophy majors come through. But why are people taking philosophy? In part, it's because we still have this idea that the goal of education should be wisdom. Right? Or at least the goal of university education, that when you graduate, you should be a generally more intelligent person who knows about a lot of stuff, right? And so we want you to become that kind of person, and that's one of the reasons why you're educated the way that you are. Right? Okay, so let's turn to Descartes. This is just reflecting on education in general. In the Discourse on Method, Part 1, Descartes reflects on his own education, and he raises this question: what is the purpose of education? So I'm just going to really briefly here summarize Descartes on this. And there's some really beautiful things that happen in the very first paragraph of the Discourse on Method. I'm going to ignore a lot of that beautiful stuff and just start here in part 3. One of the first things that we're going to see as we read this text, that Descartes wants us to read this book in a kind of funny way. I'll tell you, reading this is very different from reading Plato or Aristotle. I argue that it's one of the easiest books that we'll have to read, but there's a lot of subtle depth here. This is probably one of the most carefully constructed kind of straightforward essays that we have encountered in the course. But Descartes wants to set us up to think about this book in a special way. He says, but putting forward this essay merely as a story, if you prefer as a fable in which among some examples one can imitate, one will perhaps also find many others which one will have reason not to follow. So notice that Descartes immediately wants you to consider this text like it's a fable. And a fable, if you've ever heard of fable, what's a fable? A fable is like a story with a lesson. Descartes is trying to teach you a lesson. He says, read my life as a kind of fable, as something that's supposed to teach you a kind of lesson. Now, what's the lesson he wants to teach? It'll be kind of interesting. Just as an aside here as well, too, and Descartes says that this is his story, and really this is going to be a very personal text. Descartes is going to walk us through this book. He's going to walk us in part 1 through his education in a very personal way, describing his own personal experiences. But he intends for us to learn from his personal experiences, for us to sort of draw the same conclusions he does. But he has this interesting rhetorical style where he doesn't necessarily present arguments that directly to you to say, here, you evaluate this, as much as along the way, he's just going to show you his own line of reasoning. And he's hoping that as we read this, that we keep nodding our head along with him so that we'll draw the similar kind of conclusions and take his life as a fable that we'll learn from. Okay, so How do we begin? When Descartes asked the question, what's the purpose of his education? We'll see right here in our textbook, our text, page 3. If you go to marginal line numbers, this would have been just at the end of page 4. Descartes, this is the most important sentence for us to see Descartes' goals for all learning and education. He writes, "I have been nourished on letters since my childhood, and because I was convinced that by means of them one could acquire a clear and assured knowledge of everything that is useful in life, I had a tremendous desire to master them." You'll see that ultimately we have two goals for learning. Descartes presents two goals for learning. He says, first of all, that he was convinced that by means of them he could acquire clear and assured knowledge. And then second, he wants that clear and assured knowledge to be of the things that are useful in life. And so what are Descartes' goals? Right, I'm going to zoom up here just a little bit. When Descartes looks at the goals of education, Descartes says he wants clear and assured knowledge. Now, what's clear and assured? I'm going to call that certain. He wants something that's clear and assured. In other words, he wants certainty in his learning. And second, notice he said he wanted something that is useful. He wants things that are certain and useful, right? Another name for useful or usefulness we could call utility. Right, and that actually should ring a bell from even reading John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism, concept of utility. So Descartes says that in his idea of education, he wants knowledge that's going to be certain and useful. And then he goes throughout the rest of part 1 to sort of reflect on to what extent the things he learned really were certain and useful. Now, fun fact about Descartes, Descartes was both a philosopher and a mathematician. And we're going to see that philosophy and mathematics sort of are the fundamental contrasts that he's going to present here, right? Remember, in our classical understanding of things, in our classical idea of the university, the goal was to know for its own sake, and philosophy was the kind of pinnacle here. Ooh, one little fact I want to add here, just to think about what classical education was. The classical education was fundamentally supposed to be called like a kind of liberal education. And it has nothing to do with politics once again. It has to be a kind of education that's free from ultimately from practical ends. It's free from the kind of constraining forces about just what needs to get done. It's something that's fundamentally leisurely. And this is actually, if we go back to leisurely, is that how you spell it? I think it is. If you go back to Aristotle